Welcome to the Evidence Locker. I'm your host, and today we are opening a file that has haunted the state of Texas and the true crime community for nearly 30 years. It is a case defined by a grisly crime scene, a mother's frantic screams, and a video of silly string that many say sent an innocent woman to death row. On June 6, 1996, the suburban piece of Rowlett, Texas, was shattered by a 911 call that would change everything. But to understand the tragedy that unfolded at 5801 Eagle Drive, we have to look past the blood and the sirens and into the lives of the family who lived there. To understand what happened that night, we have to go back to the beginning. Darlie Lynn Peck was born on January 4, 1970, in Altoona, Pennsylvania. Her early years were spent in a typical American household, the kind of upbringing that many would describe as unremarkable in its normalcy. In 1990, Darlie married Darlie Routier. From the outside, the young couple appeared to be building a picture-perfect life. They eventually settled in Rowlett, Texas, an affluent suburb of Dallas. Together, they had 3 sons, Devin, who was 6, Damon, who was 5, and a baby, Drake, who was only 7 months old at the time our story begins. For a while, they were the embodiment of the suburban dream. Darren ran a successful business, an electronics testing company, and they lived in a large 2-story home on Eagle Drive. They had the cars, the house, and the beautiful children. But as any family knows, perfection is often a facade, and by the spring of 1996, the Routier household was under immense, invisible pressure. The first crack was financial. Darren's once successful business had taken an unexpected downturn. The comfort they had grown used to was slipping away, and things weren't as stable as they had once been. While the prosecution would later argue that financial greed was a motive, Darren would testify that there were no major financial problems. However, records show the family had hit a rough patch that affected every area of their lives. Beyond the money, there was the physical and mental toll of a new baby. Darlie was dealing with the exhaustion that comes with a 7-month-old who won't sleep through the night. She was sleep deprived and, like many new mothers, struggling to keep her head above water. To help with her weight and perhaps her energy levels, she began taking fen-phen, a popular diet pill at the time. We now know that fen-phen was later linked to serious side effects, including mood swings and neurological impacts. At the time, Darlie was also dealing with significant emotional distress. She had begun writing in her journal, words that felt like a desperate, honest confession. In one chilling entry, she wrote what felt like a goodbye letter to her family. It was a truth she couldn't believe she was putting on paper. A truth about her mental state that was about to become front-page news for the entire world. She was also gripped by fear. In the weeks leading up to the tragedy, Darlie's family noted she was terrified of being attacked. The fear had become so intense that she would ask family members to follow her from room to room in her own home. Was this premonition, paranoia, or something else? The night of June 5th was hot, a typical Texas summer evening. Because the upstairs area where the bedrooms were located was too warm, Darlie decided to sleep downstairs on the sofa in the living room. Her 2 oldest sons, Devin and Damon, decided to join her, rolling out sleeping bags on the floor to watch television together. Darren stayed upstairs with baby Drake. Sometime after 2 a.m., the peace was shattered. At 2:31 a.m., a 911 call blared through the dispatch center in Rowlett. For almost 6 minutes, the operator listened to the sound of pure, unadulterated chaos. Darlie was screaming, her voice thick with panic, telling the operator that someone had broken into her house, attacked her, and stabbed her children. Let's look at the timeline of that call, because every second has been scrutinized by experts for decades. Within the first few seconds, Darlie is shouting for help. The dispatcher is struggling to understand her through the hysteria, but 23 seconds into the call, the operator requests EMS and law enforcement for a medical emergency at 5801 Eagle Drive. At the 51-second mark, you can hear the operator communicating with first responders. By 1 minute and 24 seconds, Darlie is heard talking to her husband, Darren, who had rushed downstairs after hearing the screams. 2 minutes into the call, the operator asks Darlie to explain what happened. Darlie describes waking up on the couch to find a man in her living room. She described him as a white male with shoulder-length hair, wearing a black t-shirt, jeans, and a black baseball cap. She told the police that as soon as she approached him, he fled through the kitchen and into the garage, dropping a knife in the process. In her shock, she said she picked up the knife and placed it on the kitchen counter before realizing the extent of the injuries to herself and her boys. When Officer Waddell, the first responder on the scene, walked through the door, he was met with a sight he would never forget. There was blood everywhere. 6-year-old Devin was already dead, having suffered brutal stab wounds to the chest. 5-year-old Damon was still alive, struggling for breath. Darlie was also severely injured. She had deep cuts on her arm and a horrific slash across her throat. The medical reality of Darlie's injuries would later become a major point of contention. While police reports and some court transcripts would later claim her injuries were minor or superficial and self-inflicted, medical records told a much more dangerous story. The slash across her neck had come dangerously close to severing her carotid artery. In the high-stress environment of the attack, her body would have been flooded with cortisol and adrenaline, which forensic experts say can significantly impair memory and decision-making. But as the police began their initial sweep, they started to find things that didn't fit the intruder's narrative. They found a window screen in the garage that had been cut from the inside. They found the scene downstairs was chaotic, but in a way that felt staged to some investigators. Items had been moved: a lamp, a vacuum cleaner, a glass that had been shattered. The police also noted a lack of a blood trail or footprints leading out of the garage, where Darlie said the intruder had fled. And then there was the sock. Approximately 75 yards away from the house, in an alleyway, investigators found a blood-stained sock. It contained the blood of both Devin and Damon, but no foreign DNA. The defense would later argue that Darlie could not have possibly placed the sock there. Damon was alive for only about 8 minutes after his injuries, and Darlie was on the phone with 911 for 6 of those minutes. They argued there simply wasn't enough time for her to cut herself, stage the room, run 75 yards to plant a sock, and return to the phone before the police arrived. Furthermore, Darlie's blood was not found in the garage or anywhere outside the house. In those first few hours, the investigation was a whirlwind of confusion and, as some would later claim, incompetence. The crime scene was not properly secured. Multiple officers walked through the house before it was officially taped off, touching and moving objects, contaminating potential fingerprints, blood samples, and physical clues. Investigators began dusting for prints, but they reportedly used the same tools on different surfaces without cleaning them, further contaminating the evidence. They also found a palm print on a glass table in the living room, a print that did not match Darlie, Darren, or any of the investigators on scene. Officer Waddell would later testify that Darlie seemed unconcerned for her children and refused to help them. However, the 911 recording told a different story. You can clearly hear Darlie speaking to Damon, her voice full of panic and maternal concern. The 911 operator herself described Darlie as hysterical and in a state of panic. As the sun rose over Rowlett on June 6th, 2 children were dead, a mother was in the hospital fighting for her life, and a community was in shock. The police were already forming a theory, one that didn't involve the long-haired man in the baseball cap. They were looking at the woman in the hospital bed. When Officer David Waddell first entered the Routier home, he was looking for a killer who had vanished into the night. But almost immediately, the intruder theory began to lose its luster. Detectives found Darlie's account of the night difficult to believe from the start. She claimed she had slept through the brutal stabbing of her 2 sons, waking up only as the intruder was fleeing. To the veteran detectives on the scene, this seemed impossible. Within hours, before any lab tests had been conducted, the Rowlett police had largely made up their minds. The killer was already in the room. They pointed to what they called a lack of evidence of an intruder. There were no bloody footprints leading out the garage door where Darlie had said the man had fled. There was no blood on the couch where Darlie claimed she was attacked. Instead, the evidence suggested a scene that had been carefully, if clumsily, staged. The prosecution's case was built on the back of forensic science, or at least the version of it available in 1996. One of the primary pillars was the blood splatter analysis. Expert Tom Bevel testified that the patterns of blood on Darlie's nightshirt were consistent with cast-off. He argued that the blood of her sons was sprayed onto the back of her shirt as she raised the knife again and again to strike them. Then there was the kitchen sink. Using luminol, forensic analysts found trace evidence of large amounts of blood in and around the sink. The prosecution argued this was where Darlie stood to purposely cut her own throat and arm, using the water to wash away the evidence of her self-inflicted wounds before calling 911. They noted that the pattern of blood drops in the kitchen suggested someone standing still, not someone chasing an attacker as Darlie had claimed. Perhaps most damning was the bread knife from the Routier's own kitchen block. It was the murder weapon. Investigators found fiberglass rods on this knife that matched the fiberglass of the window screen in the garage. The prosecution's theory was that Darlie used this specific knife to cut the screen from the inside to create the illusion of a forced entry, then used it on her children before placing it back on the counter. They also pointed to the physical environment of the room. Broken glass was found on top of bloodstains, suggesting the glass had been shattered after the blood was already on the floor, a classic sign of a staged struggle. A vacuum cleaner in the room also had blood and glass underneath it, indicating it had been moved after the attack to make the scene look more chaotic. But why? Why would a mother with a seemingly perfect life destroy everything she loved? The prosecution painted a picture of a woman driven by greed and a desperate need for a, quote, unencumbered lifestyle. They argued the Routiers were under significant financial strain. While Darren Routier would later testify that the family had no financial problems, prosecutors pointed to their debts and argued that Darlie saw her children as obstacles to her materialistic goals. The motive, they claimed, was a pair of life insurance policies on the boys, totaling $10,000. To a woman drowning in debt, the state argued that money and the freedom from the burdens of motherhood was worth more than her children's lives. No discussion of this trial is complete without the silly string video. If the forensics provided the evidence, this video provided the villain. 4 days after the funeral for Devin and Damon, a local news crew was at the cemetery. It would have been Devin's 7th birthday. The footage showed Darlie, laughing and smiling, spraying silly string over the graves of her murdered sons. The prosecution played this video for the jury repeatedly. They didn't need to say much. The images did the work for them. To the jurors, this wasn't the behavior of a grieving mother. It was the behavior of a cold, remorseless killer. It was subconscious programming, as some have called it, designed to make the jury hate the woman sitting at the defense table. Darlie later tried to explain her actions, saying she was simply trying to honor Devin's wish to be 7 years old, doing the only thing she knew to do to celebrate him. But the damage was done. The silly string mother became a national headline, and for many, the verdict was reached in the court of public opinion long before the jury ever deliberated. As the trial approached, the defense was in a state of upheaval. Darlie's original public defender, Attorney Parks, was replaced by a flashy new lawyer, Douglas Mulder, but Mulder was hired just weeks before the trial was set to begin. While Parks had already retained 2 experienced forensic experts who had found evidence supporting the intruder theory, Mulder reportedly failed to utilize them effectively. In fact, Darlie's defense provided almost nothing to counter the state's expert testimony regarding the forensics. There were also allegations of a conflict of interest. Mulder was reportedly being paid by Darren Routier, and some argue this prevented him from thoroughly investigating Darren as a potential suspect, despite Darren being the only other adult in the house. Mulder never requested additional time to prepare, a move that many legal experts find baffling in a capital murder case. The trial began on January 6, 1997. For 5 weeks, the jury heard about blood splatter, fiberglass rods, and silly string. The prosecution focused specifically on the murder of Damon for the capital charge, though Devon's murder was always the silent backdrop. In his closing arguments, prosecutor Toby Shook summarized the enormity of the evidence. He described the crime in graphic, painstaking detail, winning the hearts and minds of the jury by painting Darlie as a monster. On February 1st, 1997, the jury returned their verdict, guilty of the capital murder of 5-year-old Damon Routier. 3 days later, they sentenced her to death by lethal injection. Darlie Routier was sent to the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas, to await her execution. The state had won its open and shut conviction. They had shown the jury a mother who didn't cry correctly and a scene that looked staged, as well as a video that made her look heartless. But as the years turned into decades, the scientific certainty of that trial began to look more like a house of cards. We've looked at how the state built its cage. Was Darlie Routier a mother who snapped? Or was she the victim of a system that decided she was guilty before the first piece of evidence was ever bagged? For nearly 30 years, Darlie has sat on death row, maintaining her innocence. And she isn't alone. A growing chorus of forensic experts, legal scholars, and private investigators argue that the case against her was built on a foundation of junk science, media bias, and a startling disregard for evidence that pointed anywhere but Darlie. Let's peel back the layers of the official story to look at the evidence the jury never fully understood, or was never allowed to see. The prosecution's strongest weapon was the claim that Darlie staged the crime scene. They pointed to broken glass on top of blood and a window screen cut from the inside. But what if the science behind those claims was fundamentally flawed? Years after the trial, the defense brought forward experts like Terry Labor, a forensic consultant who reviewed the evidence with a much more critical eye. Labor provided an affidavit stating that many pieces of physical evidence were actually not consistent with a staged scene. For instance, the broken glass that prosecutors claimed was placed on top of blood was later argued by experts to be consistent with glass breaking while still in its rack or during a struggle. Then there is the blood spatter on Darlie's nightshirt, the smoking gun of the prosecution. Expert Tom Bevel claimed the small drops on the back of her shoulder were cast off from her raising the knife to stab her children. However, in the years since, blood spatter analysis has faced a reckoning across the legal world. Darlie's supporters argue this analysis has been widely discredited and that the drops could have easily landed there during her struggle with an intruder or while she was frantically tending to her dying sons. If Darlie didn't do it, who did? The prosecution told the jury there was no evidence of an intruder, but the record shows that isn't entirely true. First, let's talk about the bloody fingerprint. Investigators found a latent palm print on the glass-top table in the family room, right where the murders occurred. It was embedded in dried blood. Crucially, that print did not match Darlie, it did not match Darren, and it did not match any of the first responders. For over 2 decades, Darlie's team has fought for advanced DNA testing on this print, believing it belongs to the man who actually held the knife. Then, there are the unidentified hairs. Forensic sweeps found facial and pubic hairs at the crime scene that didn't belong to anyone in the family. And don't forget the sock. A bloody sock was found 75 yards away from the house in an alleyway. It had the DNA of the boys on it. The prosecution said Darlie planted it, but consider the timeline. Darlie was on the phone with 911 for nearly 6 minutes. screaming and talking to the operator. Damon was alive for only about 8 minutes after the attack began. How could a woman with a slashed throat and severe arm wounds run 75 yards, plant a sock, and run back to be on the phone in a state of total hysteria, all while her children lay dying? One of the most tragic aspects of the trial is the defense Darlie received. Her lead attorney, Douglas Mulder, was a high-profile lawyer, but he was hired only weeks before the trial was set to begin. In a capital murder case, attorneys usually spend a year or more preparing. Mulder had 9 weeks. Because of this rush, critical opportunities were missed. Darlie's original public defender had already hired forensic experts who were prepared to testify that the scene showed signs of a real struggle. Mulder didn't use them. He didn't call a forensic expert to the stand to refute the state's claims about the blood spatter or the staged glass. There was also a glaring conflict of interest. Mulder was also representing Darlie's husband, Darren Routier, on a separate legal matter. This meant he could not effectively investigate or point the finger at Darren as a potential suspect, even though Darren was the only other adult in the house and stood to benefit from a significant life insurance policy on Darlie. To this day, Darren has never been thoroughly investigated, despite blood-stained shoes being found in the garage that were never fully explained. We have to talk about that video one more time. The prosecution used it to turn the world against Darlie, but they didn't show the jury the whole story. Before the birthday party at the grave, the family held a solemn, 2-hour prayer service to honor the boys. They cried, they prayed, and they mourned. The silly string celebration was a small, 5-minute moment at the end of a long day of grieving, intended to honor Devin's wish to have a fun 7th birthday. But the news cameras and the prosecutors edited out the 2 hours of prayer and showed only the 5 minutes of laughter. As Darlie later said from prison, quote, "How do you know how you're going to act when you lose 2 children?" Unquote. The jury was encouraged to judge her character based on a soundbite rather than the facts of the case. Finally, we look at Darlie's wounds. The prosecution called them superficial, but the doctors who actually treated her in the hospital saw something different. Her throat was slashed so deeply that the knife came within 2 millimeters of her carotid artery. Many medical experts have argued that it is almost unheard of for a person to inflict such a dangerous, life-threatening wound on themselves as part of a cover-up. If she had been a fraction of an inch off, she would have bled to death in minutes. Today, Darlie Routier remains at the Mountain View Unit in Gatesville, Texas. She has spent more than half her life behind bars for a crime she says she didn't commit. Organizations like the Innocence Project have taken an interest in her case, citing the reliance on questionable forensics and the overwhelming media bias that tainted her trial. Since 2008, multiple courts have granted her the right to a new, advanced DNA testing. They are testing the bloody fingerprint, the nightshirt, and the sock, but the wheels of justice turn slowly. As of 2024, conclusive results that could exonerate her have still not been released to the public. As we close the file on Darlie Routier, we are left with a haunting realization. The justice system is a human system, and humans are susceptible to bias, to shortcuts, and to the desire for a simple villain. Whether you believe Darlie is a cold-blooded killer or a victim of a terrible mistake, one thing is certain: the evidence. Now, I want to clarify, I am not saying we should release Darlie. This is a solved Saturday case after all, and this would not be the first time a mother has killed her children. But I do think some aspects of this case should receive a second look, just to be certain. I feel with any case that has this much media attention, opinions of the public will affect the outcome. And if the media already decided she was guilty, all of the evidence may not have received a fair look. Whether or not Darlie is guilty, 2 young boys were senselessly murdered. I want people to hear this case so that we can remember Damon and Devin, so that they aren't just faceless victims lost to time. Thank you for listening. This has been The Evidence Locker. This podcast is written and hosted by me, Shay, and edited by my husband, Toby. If you enjoyed today's episode, give us a like and a follow. Maybe leave a comment below letting us know which case you want brought to the public's attention next. Your support really helps. Remember, stay curious, stay safe. I'll see you next week as we open another locker.